Picture this: a hardened German Wehrmacht officer, a man who had fought across the burning sands of North Africa, who had watched his brothers in arms die under Allied bombs, who had been told since childhood that America was a crumbling, racially inferior, morally bankrupt nation on the edge of collapse. This man steps off a gangplank onto American soil for the first time. And what destroys him isn't a rifle barrel pressed to his chest. It isn't a guard's boot. It isn't humiliation or starvation or a cold concrete cell. What shatters everything he has ever believed, what cracks his entire worldview like a hammer through glass, is a teenage girl sharing a milkshake with a boy at a soda fountain, and he cannot stop staring. This is the story of 425,000 German prisoners of war who arrived in America between 1943 and 1946. Men who expected brutality and found abundance. Men who expected hatred and found kindness. Men who expected a weak, divided, racially inferior nation and instead found the most powerful, most confusing, most psychologically devastating civilization they had ever encountered. Not devastating in the way bombs are devastating. Devastating in the way truth is devastating, when you've spent your entire life believing a lie. By the time this story ends, you will understand why historians call what happened in those American prison camps the most successful ideological transformation in all of military history, and you will never look at American normalcy the same way again. To understand what these men felt when they arrived, you have to understand what they had been told. From the moment Adolf Hitler rose to power, the Nazi propaganda machine operated like a 24-hour factory, pumping out a single relentless message: America was finished. America was a mongrel nation, racially polluted, spiritually bankrupt, too comfortable and too lazy to fight. Its cities were controlled by Jewish bankers and black jazz musicians who had corrupted the pure American bloodline beyond saving. Its workers were soft, its soldiers were cowards, its democracy was a sick joke, a system designed to make strong nations weak through endless, pointless argument. Joseph Goebbels himself called American democracy a disease, and for 12 years, an entire generation of German soldiers had breathed this message like air. So when these men finally crossed the Atlantic as prisoners, crowded into the holds of American transport ships, bracing for the worst, they carried their worldview with them like armor. They expected what Germany would have given enemy prisoners: minimal food, brutal guards, crushing labor designed to break body and spirit. They expected punishment. What they got was something far more psychologically destructive than punishment. They got America. And America, in its messy, chaotic, inexplicable, infuriating, heartbreaking normality, did what no bomb, no bullet, and no battlefield defeat ever could. It made them question everything. The first shock came before the ships even docked. It was June 4th, 1943. The Virginia coastline materialized through the morning haze as the transport vessels approached Norfolk Naval Base. Hermann Böttcher, a Wehrmacht non-commissioned officer who would later write one of the most detailed memoirs ever published about prisoner of war life in America, gripped the ship's railing as the docks came into focus. His legs were unsteady after 14 days crossing the Atlantic. His mind was braced for what came next. And then he saw it. The docks of Norfolk sprawled across 4,300 acres, a maze of cranes and warehouses and warships that stretched beyond the limits of sight. But it wasn't the scale that stopped Böttcher cold. It was who was working there. White American dock workers and black American dock workers operating side by side, not as master and servant, not as overseer and laborer, side by side, running the same machinery, handling the same loads, wearing the same coveralls, working toward the same goal. Women in work clothes operated cranes. Children sold newspapers at the gates. Civilians wandered freely near warships worth millions of dollars. And nobody, not a single person on those vast, bustling docks, seemed to think any of this was remarkable. Butcher leaned toward the man behind him. Die spinnen die Amerikaner. The Americans are crazy. He had no other framework for it. His entire understanding of race, of war, of how a nation at war was supposed to behave, none of it had a category for this. He would spend the next 2 years trying to build one. The processing that followed was the second impossibility. German military doctrine, practiced from Poland to France to the deserts of North Africa, treated prisoners as one of two things: assets to exploit or burdens to eliminate. The Geneva Convention was a document Germany acknowledged when convenient and ignored when not. So when American officers began reading the Geneva Convention aloud in German, carefully explaining to these prisoners their rights, their entitlements, their protections, many of the men assumed it was mockery, a cruel joke before the real treatment began. Then the Red Cross packages arrived, distributed in several documented cases by Jewish American military personnel. Sergeants with unmistakably Jewish surnames handing packages to men who had served in a military that had made the extermination of Jewish people a matter of state policy. And one of those same personnel calmly mentioned that kosher meals were available for any Jewish prisoners in the group. Several German Wehrmacht soldiers laughed nervously, absolutely certain they were being toyed with. The laughter died when they realized nobody was joking. The medical inspections that followed defied every expectation built by years of war. Men with wounds, men bleeding from the savage closing stages of the North African campaign, received penicillin, the miracle drug, the antibiotic that German field hospitals were rationing to critical cases, that German Wehrmacht soldiers prayed they would receive in time, that the German military considered one of the most precious medical resources in existence. American military doctors administered it to enemy prisoners as a matter of routine. Swiss Red Cross inspector Guy Meyer noted in his July 1943 report, with barely concealed astonishment, that medical treatment provided to German prisoners equaled or exceeded that given to American military personnel. And then, in one of those small moments that carry the weight of an entire world crumbling, a black American medical technician approached a group of Wehrmacht officers for routine blood screening. He was calm, professional, efficient. He had a job to do, and he was doing it. In Nazi Germany, this physical contact between races was not just socially forbidden, it was illegal. Men had gone to concentration camps for less. Here, on an American military base, it was so unremarkable that the technician didn't even look up from his work. The officers looked at each other. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say. The first meal broke something in all of them. German prisoners were led to a mess hall. American sailors were already eating. These were not separate facilities on opposite sides of the installation. This was the same mess hall, the same food lines, the same quality of meals. Enemies who had been trying to kill each other in brutal convoy battles across the North Atlantic sat in the same building, 50 feet apart, eating food of identical quality. The Americans showed almost no interest in the prisoners whatsoever. They were far more focused on a radio broadcast of a baseball game, a sport these prisoners had never seen and could not begin to understand, than the enemy soldiers sharing their dining facility. It was this casual indifference that hit hardest, not hatred, not curiosity, indifference, as though the presence of 2,500 enemy prisoners of war at lunchtime was barely worth noting. The 3-day train journey to the interior camps delivered shock after shock after shock. Unlike the secret prisoner movements that Germany conducted, boxcars, sealed compartments, routes chosen specifically to prevent the enemy from seeing anything strategically useful, American authorities made essentially no attempt to hide the prisoners or hide America from the prisoners. The trains were actual passenger pouches, cushioned seats, windows. The routes passed through the heart of American industrial power, and the American military apparently saw no reason to concern itself with what the prisoners might observe. At Union Station in Washington, D.C., documented in station records from June 1943, German prisoners sat in coaches watching American families say goodbye to soldiers headed to training camps. Wives kissed husbands on public platforms. Children waved small flags. Teenagers shared food at the station restaurant, boys and girls together, unsupervised, laughing, completely unbothered by the war raging across both oceans. The same platform hosted enemy prisoners and grieving American families, separated only by windows and guards who seemed primarily concerned with directing foot traffic rather than maintaining any kind of martial vigilance. Through Baltimore, prisoners could see the Glenn L. Martin aircraft plant. Its parking lots were visible from the train, filled with workers' personal automobiles, a sight that deserved its own moment of shock because the idea of ordinary factory workers owning private vehicles was something most of these men had never encountered in Germany. And lined up beside those lots, clearly visible, were B-26 bombers awaiting delivery. No camouflage netting, no security perimeter, no attempt whatsoever to hide what was being built there. Just American industry, operating in broad daylight, completely visible to enemy prisoners of war. Through Pennsylvania, the orange glow of blast furnaces lit the night sky. Steel mills running continuous shifts, coal mines operating around the clock. And surrounding each industrial complex, not barracks, not worker dormitories, not the cramped communal housing of German industrial towns, individual houses, each with its own garden, each burning electric lights in every window, radio antennas on every roof. At a stop in Harrisburg, prisoners watched workers changing shifts, men carrying lunchboxes, wearing leather shoes and wristwatches, driving personal cars to the parking area. And then one of those workers reached into his lunchbox, pulled out a half-eaten apple, looked at it for a moment and threw it away, then opened a fresh one. Betcher described this moment in his memoir as the one that first cracked his certainty. A laborer, a factory worker, a man who in Germany would have been considered working class, ordinary, unremarkable, had thrown away food, had discarded a perfectly edible apple because he felt like a fresh one. This man had options. This man had enough. This man lived in a country so abundant that its factory workers could be casually wasteful in a way that German officers could not afford to be. The train rolled on through the American night, and 2,500 hardened military minds sat in silence, watching America scroll past the windows, and tried to find a framework that could hold what they were seeing. They couldn't find one. Camp Hearn, Texas, announced itself on the horizon as the buses arrived in December 1942's newly constructed reality near the town of Hearn in Robertson County. It would house up to 4,800 German prisoners, and its construction was so thoroughly documented in Army Corps of Engineers records that historians have been able to reconstruct virtually every detail of what these men walked into, which is important because what they walked into makes no sense if you approach it with a wartime mind. Wooden barracks with electric lights, not oil lamps, electric lights that worked. Indoor plumbing with flush toilets, hot water heaters in every building, individual beds with mattresses, sheets, and blankets, not straw, not bare boards, mattresses. Recreation halls with ping-pong tables, musical instruments, and libraries. medical facilities containing equipment that many German civilian hospitals did not possess, X-ray machines, surgical suites, dental chairs, pharmaceutical supplies, including penicillin administered as standard care. Swiss inspector Emil Sandstrom, in his August 1943 report, noted that conditions at Camp Herne exceeded not only Geneva Convention requirements, but surpassed the living conditions many of these men had known as civilians in Germany before the war. The camp commander, Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Stiles, had studied German at university before the war. He addressed arriving prisoners in their own language. He explained camp rules, and then he explained something that nobody expected. The prisoners would largely govern themselves within the compounds. They would elect spokesmen, organize their own activities, manage their own schedules within military requirements. Self-governance for enemies. The men looked at each other the way people look at each other when they're certain they've misheard something important. It was not a trap. It was not a trick. American military doctrine had calculated correctly that men who were given dignity and responsibility were less likely to be dangerous. Give a prisoner self-governance, give him work that earns him small wages, give him a library and a ping-pong table and a bed with real sheets, and the psychological calculus of imprisonment shifts entirely. The Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal's General's Office had figured out something that military commanders throughout history had missed. You don't break enemies by crushing them. You transform them by confusing them, by showing them something they cannot dismiss, cannot explain away, and cannot stop thinking about. But the canteen, the camp store where prisoners could spend script earned from voluntary labor, that may have done more psychological damage to Nazi ideology than anything else in the first weeks. Cigarettes, chocolate, soap, writing materials, musical instruments, art supplies. Enemy prisoners could shop, could choose, could have preferences catered to. The War Department, documented in Quartermaster Corps records, had authorized these sales on the specific theory that small comforts would maintain prisoner morale. The idea was purely practical. The effect was something far beyond practical. It was the daily, mundane, grinding accumulation of evidence that this was a country that believed even its enemies deserved to be treated as human beings. That idea, that concept so simple and so alien to everything these men had been taught, was the thread that once pulled would unravel everything. By September 1943, labor shortages across Texas had created an unprecedented situation. German prisoners of war were being sent to work in American agriculture and industry. The War Manpower Commission coordinated with the Provost Marshal's General's Office to authorize prisoner labor on a massive scale, and the records of these work programs, preserved in National Archives Record Group 389, tell a story of culture shock so complete and so sustained that it functioned slowly like surgery on a belief system. The King Ranch near Kingsville, Texas, was where some prisoners first understood the true scale of what they were dealing with. The ranch covered 825,000 acres. 825,000 acres, larger than the entire state of Rhode Island. German prisoners worked cattle operations alongside Mexican-American vaqueros and black ranch hands. The racial mixing in work, even the limited racial mixing that Texas in 1943 permitted, directly contradicted everything Nazi racial hierarchy theory had built. A combine harvester replaced dozens of workers in a single afternoon. Trucks, not horse-drawn wagons, moved crops. Small civilian aircraft surveyed cattle herds from the air. Ranch foreman Richard Kleiberg, Jr. treated German prisoners of war the way you treat temporary employees, with professional respect and the expectation of professional work, rather than the way you treat enemies. At cotton gins throughout Texas, in Taylor, in Caldwell, in Waller County, prisoners watched processing speeds that seemed physically impossible by European standards. The Herne Cotton Oil Mill processed more cotton in a single day than German textile mills handled in a month. The workers took regular breaks. They ate full lunches. They listened to radios while they worked. The relationship between how well you treated workers and how productively those workers performed was on display in every shift, every operation, every yield report. And it was the opposite of everything that Wehrmacht experience had taught about the relationship between discipline and output. But the most psychologically destabilizing moment at these work sites wasn't the machinery or the productivity, it was the politics. German prisoners, monitored by FBI agents who later declassified their reports in the 1970s, were repeatedly stunned to witness American farmers, ordinary men, citizens of the nation at war, openly criticizing President Roosevelt, complaining about government policies, arguing with federal inspectors. At one documented incident near Bryan, Texas, a farmer told a Department of Agriculture inspector to go to hell over a crop allocation dispute. The farmer faced no consequences, no arrest, no visit in the night from anyone in a dark uniform. The inspector probably filed a complaint. The farmer probably shrugged, and the German prisoner standing nearby watched this happen and felt the floor shift beneath their feet. In Nazi Germany, a word against the Führer, a single, private, whispered word, could end in a concentration camp. Here, a man could tell a government official to go to hell in front of witnesses and then go back to his corn. The local newspapers were another weapon that nobody recognized as a weapon. The Herne Democrat, the Bryan Daily Eagle, the Temple Daily Telegram, these papers ran stories about prisoner work details and community interactions throughout the war. They reported on German POWs with a matter-of-fact directness that itself communicated something important. These men were not monsters. They were not secret weapons of sabotage. They were men, and the newspapers treated them accordingly. Because in a free press, the story is the story, and the story in Robertson County, Texas in 1943 happened to involve a few thousand Germans picking cotton. But access to American newspapers also meant something more systematically damaging. These papers criticized the war effort. They published articles about production problems. They discussed strategic failures. Military correspondents questioned tactics. Comedians like Bob Hope mocked generals on radio programs that drifted into recreation halls on summer evenings. Edward R. Murrow interrogated strategic decisions with a journalist's relentless precision, and his broadcasts were accessible to enemy prisoners in recreation halls across the country. Congress debated military appropriations publicly, argued about them, shouted about them, sometimes voted against them, and the full spectrum of democratic dissent was transmitted nationally, receivable by anyone with a radio. To German military minds, this was democratic suicide, a nation at war, tearing itself apart in public, exposing its disagreements to the world. And yet, the factories kept running, the ships kept launching, the bombs kept falling on German cities. The contradiction was maddening. How could a nation this divided, this chaotic, this apparently ungovernable, be producing the most powerful war machine in human history? The answer, that democracy's strength comes from its chaos, not despite it, was one that would take years to fully understand, but the question itself was enough to start the process. December 1943 at Camp Herne is one of the most extensively documented prisoner of war episodes in American military history, and it is the episode that appears most frequently in the memoirs of men who were there. Because what the town of Herne, Texas did in December 1943 is even now almost impossible to fully absorb. The town had a population of roughly 2,000 people. Many of them had sons, brothers, fathers, and husbands serving overseas, fighting the very Germans who were now living and working in Robertson County. And what these 2,000 people decided to do for Christmas 1943 was collect gifts for the prisoners. Not from obligation, not from military directive, because they wanted to, because it was Christmas, and Christmas meant something to them, and if you believed in Christmas, really believed in it, you didn't get to choose who deserved kindness based on whether they were trying to kill your son. The Hearn Democrat published a full accounting of the donations on December 23, 1943. Local churches collected 4,800 individual gift packages. Schools contributed handmade cards and decorations. The American Legion Post 164, veterans of the First World War, men who had personally fought Germans in the trenches of France, donated cigarettes, candy, and sports equipment to the current generation of German enemies. The Lions Club provided musical instruments. The Garden Club decorated the camp with holly and evergreen boughs. The camp Christmas tree stood 30 feet tall in the main compound, with electric lights that burned continuously through the night. Local churches organized Christmas concerts in German. The First Methodist Church Choir learned German Christmas carols phonetically. Mrs. Sarah Patterson, the choir director, whose own son was serving in Italy, fighting Germans who might have been friends with some of these very prisoners, stood before her congregation and led them in singing enemy Christmas carols to the enemy who had been trying to kill her boy. Guard reports from that night describe several prisoners breaking down emotionally. Men who had not wept at Tobruk or El Alamein, men who had survived artillery barrages and tank warfare and the blistering heat of African desert fighting, these men wept at German Christmas carols sung by an American woman whose son was at war with their country. Because it was not weakness that broke them. It was the impossible, inexplicable magnitude of it, the sheer human bewilderment of being treated with this kind of grace. And then they sat down to Christmas dinner. Quartermaster records preserved the menu in full. Roast turkey, 1 pound per man, ham, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, cornbread stuffing, cranberry sauce, mince pie, apple pie, ice cream, beer for enlisted men, and California wine for officers. The meal totaled approximately 5,000 calories per person. Meanwhile, German civilians, their mothers, their wives at home, were surviving on roughly 1,200 calories a day when rations were available at all. The men at Camp Hearn ate more at one Christmas dinner than their families ate in 4 days. Butcher wrote about this moment with an honesty that cuts through 7 decades of history. He wrote that the kindness wasn't weakness. He wrote that it was strength, the confidence of victors who already knew they had won, not just the war, but the peace that would follow. He couldn't dismiss it as manipulation. He couldn't explain it as self-interest. It was simply people being people, doing what they thought was right, in the middle of a war that gave them every reason to do otherwise. And that was the one thing that 12 years of Nazi propaganda had never prepared him for. It had no answer for genuine goodness. It had no framework for authentic human kindness extended to enemies without calculation or expectation of return. His armor didn't fall all at once. It corroded, piece by piece, observation by observation, through the entire arc of his time in Texas, until the day he looked at what he believed and realized he was looking at ruins. The racial dynamics that German prisoners encountered in Texas were more complex and more psychologically demanding than anything else they witnessed, and they deserved the full weight of their complexity. At Camp Hearn, black soldiers from the 392nd Infantry Regiment periodically served guard duty. Wehrmacht prisoners, men raised in a society where racial hierarchy was not just cultural preference but legal mandate, found themselves taking orders from black Americans. Several prisoners formally requested transfers. Camp Commander Stiles documented these requests in his December 1943 report and noted, with the kind of bureaucratic clarity that historians love, that they were received and ignored. You do not get to request a transfer because you dislike the race of the man guarding you. That is not how Camp Hearn works. But here is where the complexity becomes genuinely painful. These same German prisoners, these enemies, these men who had fought for a regime whose racial ideology was among the most monstrous in human history, could eat in Hearn restaurants that refused service to the black soldiers guarding them. They could attend movie theaters where their black guards couldn't sit in the main section. The Crow laws of 1943 Texas created a grotesque paradox in which enemy prisoners had social freedoms denied to American citizens. The Wehrmacht soldiers, who had been ordered about by black guards at camp, could then go into town and be served before those guards at a lunch counter. German prisoners documented this contradiction with a confusion that was itself a form of moral progress. They had arrived with certainty about racial hierarchy. What they found was a country whose racial injustice contradicted its stated ideals, whose racial practices were indefensible by any logic, including Nazi logic, because the segregation had nothing to do with the productivity or ability or character of black Americans. At the agricultural work sites, documented in Farm Security Administration records, German prisoners worked alongside black laborers who outperformed them at cotton picking, not because of any biological factor, but because these men had been doing this work for years and were skilled at it. The Nazi theory of racial hierarchy kept colliding with the observable reality that skill is skill, work is work, and the man who picks more cotton by the end of the day is the more productive worker, regardless of what anyone's ideology says about his blood. It didn't create converts to racial justice, but it planted questions that had no good answers, and questions with no good answers are the beginning of the end of certainty. Inside the camps, meanwhile, something more deliberate was happening. The Special Projects Division of the Provost Marshal General's Office had established what it called to the prisoners simply voluntary education. The declassified records of Record Group 389 reveal something considerably more sophisticated. The division had developed a detailed psychological operation based on exposure, identification, and cultivation of democratic values, engineered to function without ever appearing to be what it was. Because nothing kills genuine transformation faster than the sense that you are being manipulated. The Americans had figured this out. The education was real. The books were real. The access to genuine information was real. The transformation it produced was therefore real. The camp library grew from 500 volumes donated by Hearn citizens to over 5,000 volumes by August 1944. It contained works by German authors that the Nazi regime had banned and burned. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, works by Jewish authors whose names could not be spoken in Germany with risk. A German prisoner of war in Texas could read books that would have meant arrest, imprisonment, or death to possess back home. The psychological weight of this was staggering. The books existed. The ideas existed. The thoughts that the Nazi regime had tried to eliminate were sitting in a library in Robertson County, Texas, waiting to be read. Sam Houston State Teachers College provided correspondence courses. College records show 340 German prisoners enrolled in courses between 1944 and 1945, in courses including English, American history, mathematics, and agricultural science. Professors visited Camp Hearn monthly for lectures and examinations. Prisoners sat in classrooms studying American history from American professors and discovered a national story that was complicated and imperfect and honest about its complications and imperfections, which was itself revolutionary for men who had only ever been given national mythology. The camp newspaper, Der Spiegel, the Mirror, evolved in its pages like a time-lapse recording of ideological transformation. Early editions from 1943 echoed the cadences of Nazi propaganda almost unconsciously because that was the only political language most of these men knew. By late 1944, the same publication was publishing debates about democracy, discussions of post-war governance, and analyses of American political philosophy. The change was not forced, it was not directed. It grew from the inside, from men who were reading different books, thinking different thoughts, and finding that the new framework fit the evidence better than the old one. The division had identified 3 categories among the prisoner population: Roughly 10% were anti-Nazi, men who had opposed or had serious doubts about the regime before capture. About 75% were non-political, soldiers who had fought out of duty, patriotism, or simple survival instinct without deep ideological commitment. And 15% were ardent Nazis, true believers whose commitment to the ideology was profound and largely unreachable. The program focused its energy on the non-political middle, understood that exposure and evidence worked on open minds, and used the anti-Nazi minority as cultivated influencers within barracks communities. Anti-Nazi prisoners received additional education and privileges. They became discussion group moderators, newspaper editors, barracks leaders. Their influence spread not through lecture or argument, but through proximity and example. Major Maxwell McKnight, the assistant executive officer, whose papers are preserved at the Hoover Institution, wrote in a November 1944 report that approximately 60% of non-political prisoners showed measurable movement toward democratic ideals after 6 months of exposure to American society and targeted education. 60% in 6 months, without a single speech demanding conversion, without propaganda posters or mandatory re-education sessions, through books and baseball games and farmers arguing with federal inspectors and women flying military aircraft, and a Christmas dinner that nobody in Germany would have believed. The work sites continued their delivering, grinding, accumulative shocks. At the Lone Star Steel Plant in Dangerfield, Texas, where prisoners worked from 1944 onward, monthly production exceeded the entire Ruhr Valley's annual output before Allied bombing. The secret, documented in company records with almost comic clarity, wasn't machinery alone, it was motivation. Workers competed for production bonuses. They suggested efficiency improvements. They wore company pins. They bought war bonds with overtime pay. They painted the names of bomber planes on steel designated for military use. They took pride in what they made. Charts displayed each shift's output like sports scores. The relationship between worker dignity and industrial productivity was on display in every number, every shift, every ton of steel. And it was the complete inverse of what these prisoners had experienced in the German military-industrial system. At food processing plants, the shock was different, more visceral, more personal. At the Stokely Brothers Cannery in Cameron, Texas, verified through Milam County historical records as employing prisoners from Camp Hearn, perfectly edible produce was discarded for cosmetic flaws: tomatoes slightly underripe, corn with irregular kernels, beans with minor blemishes, all of it destroyed, discarded, dumped, because it did not meet canning standards. In Germany, their families were eating less than 1,200 calories a day when food was available at all. Here, food that would have been treasure in any German city was garbage. Corporal Friedrich Müller wrote home about this moment, and his letter was preserved in Red Cross archives because the censors found it too bewildering to be a security risk. He described destroying hundreds of pounds of fruit that didn't meet canning standards. He described the American supervisor apologizing to the prisoners for the waste. And then he wrote a line that stops you cold. The supervisor didn't understand, Müller said, that he was apologizing for abundance that the prisoners couldn't imagine. An American man apologizing to German prisoners of war for having too much food. The 1944 presidential election campaign, observed through camps throughout the country, produced a specific kind of cognitive crisis in men trained by authoritarian political culture. Franklin Roosevelt faced serious challenge from Thomas Dewey in wartime. Republicans criticized war management in speeches that were broadcast nationally. Newspapers published opposition views without consequence. Political cartoons mocked the commander-in-chief with an irreverence that would have resulted in execution in Berlin. Congress debated military appropriations, publicly, loudly, with full dissenting voices, and the debates were transmitted on radio to anyone with a receiver. And the war effort, despite all of this apparent chaos, was not weakening, it was strengthening. The factories were running faster, the ships were launching in greater numbers, The bombers were appearing over German cities in formations that darkened the sky. The democracy was not tearing itself apart. It was, through its chaos, finding a strength that no authoritarian system could replicate. Because authoritarian strength is the strength of a fist, and democratic strength is the strength of 10,000 people all pulling in the same general direction for their own overlapping reasons. One can be broken, the other cannot. Prisoners sat in recreation halls, listening to radio programs where senators called the president a fool, where journalists questioned whether military strategy made sense, where citizens demanded answers that the government was sometimes unable to provide, and watched as this society somehow kept winning a war against militaries that had been specifically designed to win wars. It made no sense until it did. There were prisoners for whom transformation came suddenly, in a single moment that collapsed the old world and built the new one. There were others for whom it came the way spring comes, gradually, imperceptibly, until one morning you look around and everything is different and you can't identify the exact moment it changed. Georg Gartner had been a soldier with Rommel's Africa Corps. He arrived in America certain of his cause, uncertain of his future, and completely unprepared for what happened to him. After the war ended, when repatriation began and the boats left for a destroyed, starving, humiliated Germany, Gartner made a decision that tells you everything you need to know about what America had done to him. He escaped from Camp Deeming, New Mexico, in September 1945, but he didn't try to flee the country. He didn't head for a neutral border. He went deeper into America. He gave himself an American name, Dennis Wiles, found work as a Kennis instructor in California, married an American woman, raised children, lived as an American for 40 years. When he finally surrendered in 1985 for a television documentary, he had spent more of his life in America than in Germany. His autobiography is titled Hitler's Last Soldier in America. The title is accurate, but the man who wrote it was American in everything but paperwork long before he put his name on the surrender document. Reinhold Pabel escaped from a camp in Illinois in 1945, not from mistreatment, but from what he described in his memoir as boredom and curiosity about American life. He moved to Chicago. He worked in bookstores. He married an American woman. He lived as a free man under a false name, completely integrated into American society for 7 years. When he voluntarily surrendered in 1953, the FBI investigation revealed that he committed no crimes beyond illegal entry. He received citizenship in 1959. He became a successful businessman. He later sponsored other German immigrants, helping them build lives in the country that had once held him behind wire. The country that had once held him behind wire and given him a bed with real sheets, a library full of books, a canteen where he could buy chocolate, and Christmas dinner from neighbors whose sons were fighting to kill him. Bötter emigrated to America in 1953. He became a citizen in 1958. He worked as an engineer for General Motors until retirement. He wrote his memoir. He documented everything. And in the pages of that memoir, you can watch a man's certainty disassemble itself, piece by piece, one American impossibility at a time, until the man who arrived at Norfolk, gripping the railing with unsteady legs and muttering that the Americans were crazy, becomes a man who understood, finally, what the craziness was actually made of. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, American authorities did something that had no precedent in the history of warfare. They began preparing prisoners to go home. Not just repatriating them, preparing them. The War Department initiated comprehensive programs to equip returning prisoners of war with the skills and knowledge needed to help rebuild a destroyed democratic society. Courses in civil administration, agricultural training focused on feeding starving populations, public health techniques for epidemic prevention, infrastructure reconstruction. The Special Projects Division identified potential democratic leaders among the prisoner population and provided additional training in governance and administration. State Department officials visited camps to explain American intentions for post-war Germany. They described the Marshall Plan before it was publicly announced. They explained that America intended to rebuild the country it had just destroyed, not from weakness, not from sentimentality, but from the strategic conviction that a rebuilt, democratic, stable Germany was worth infinitely more to the world than a crushed, humiliated, radicalized one. This was to men who grew up with a worldview based on racial struggle and national survival, the most incomprehensible thing yet. The conquerors wanted to help the conquered rebuild, not as a trick, not as a condition of surrender, because it was the right thing to do and because it would produce better outcomes for everyone. By May 1945, 31,000 prisoners were enrolled in vocational training. 18,000 were studying English, 12,000 were in agricultural programs, 8,500 in technical courses, 6,200 in business administration. The scale of this preparation was a statement, unspoken but unmistakable, about what America thought these men could become.
The numbers that came after tell the story of what they did become. Of 425,000 German prisoners of war held in the United States, only 2,222 escape attempts occurred. That is 0.52%. Only 54 escapes lasted more than 30 days. 7 confirmed cases of sabotage, 178 documented work refusals, and 87% of eligible prisoners participated voluntarily in the labor programs, not because they were forced, but because the combination of fair treatment, reasonable wages, and human dignity made cooperation the obvious choice. Post-war surveys conducted by American occupation authorities found that 74% of returned prisoners of war held favorable views of American democracy. 61% supported the Marshall Plan when it was announced. 55% advocated for a German-American alliance. 38% expressed a desire to emigrate to the United States. 23% maintained correspondence with American families for years after the war. 5,000 former prisoners legally immigrated to America in the 1950s. Of those who became eligible for citizenship, 92% naturalized within the eligible time frame. Their success rates, measured by employment, home ownership, and absence of criminal records, exceeded those of general immigrant populations. And what happened in West Germany when these men went home is the part that history books sometimes skip over because it sounds too good to be true. 48 former Camp Herne and other American camp prisoners became members of the Bundestag, the parliament of the new democratic Germany. 312 served as mayors or city councilors. 1,847 worked in agricultural modernization programs that would transform West German farming using techniques learned on Texas ranches. 2,341 taught in reconstituted German schools, teaching children who had been born into totalitarianism about democracy, about freedom of press, about the right to disagree with your government without fear. 4,165 managed businesses using American management methods they had absorbed during their years in camp and on work details. Hans-Georg Fenstermacher, a former prisoner who became a German industrialist, told American historians in 1965 that the prisoners returned from America with more than memories. They returned with knowledge of how democracy functions, how free markets operate, how diverse peoples cooperate. They had seen the future, and they knew it worked. Camp Herne closed in December 1945, but something extraordinary happened in the years after it closed. The connections it had forged did not close with it. Letters arrived in Herne, Texas from West Germany for 4 decades. Christmas cards came annually from former prisoners to the families who had given them gifts in December 1943.
These were not pro forma exchanges. These were the correspondence of people who had been through something together, something strange and unprecedented and historically important, and who wanted someone on the other side of the world to know that they remembered. The last known former prisoner of Camp Hearn died in 2001. By then, he had been exchanging Christmas cards with a Texas family for 56 years. In 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, 50 former Camp Hearn prisoners of war returned to Texas for a reunion. The Hearn Democrat covered it extensively, as it had covered everything. Former enemies embraced former guards. Wehrmacht veterans placed flowers at the American Legion Memorial. Fritz Zimmermann, speaking for the group, said something that has been cited by historians as one of the clearest statements of what the American prisoner of war experience actually achieved. He said, "We came as enemies, believing in racial superiority and national destiny. We left as friends, understanding that democracy's chaos is its strength, that diversity creates rather than weakens unity." Racial superiority, national destiny, these were the pillars of everything these men had been built upon, and a women's choir singing German Christmas carols, and a 15-cent apple thrown away by a factory worker, and a black doctor drawing blood for a routine health screening, and a farmer telling a federal inspector to go to hell without consequence. These things, accumulated over months and years, had brought those pillars down more completely than any bomb ever could. This is the story that history doesn't tell loudly enough. It tells the battles, it tells the strategies, it tells the numbers, the tonnage and the sorties and the casualties, and the territory gained and lost and gained again. And all of that matters, all of it is real, all of it cost more than any of us can truly comprehend. But the story of 425,000 German men who arrived in America expecting to find a weak and inferior nation, and instead found something they had no category for, that story is different. That story is about what happens when a society is so genuinely itself, so authentically committed to its own messy, imperfect, chaotic values that it cannot help but transform anyone who spends enough time inside it. America didn't set out to re-educate these men. It set out to hold them humanely, use their labor where possible, keep them from causing trouble, and send them home when the war was over. The transformation was a side effect of America simply being America, of women flying military aircraft because they were capable of it and someone needed it done, of black doctors treating white patients because that was the job and the job mattered, of farmers cursing at government officials because they disagreed and they had the right to say so, of communities giving Christmas presents to enemies because it was Christmas and that's what Christmas meant. The prisoners arrived expecting to find the America they had been told about, the weak, the divided, the mongrel nation on the edge of collapse. Instead, they found the America that actually existed. And the America that actually existed, with all its contradictions and injustices and impossible abundance and inexplicable kindness, was more powerful than anything Goebbels had ever tried to arm them against. They came as soldiers of a collapsing empire. They left as witnesses to something they couldn't fully name, but couldn't stop describing. And when they went home to the ruins of Germany and began building something new from the rubble, they built it using the blueprints they had absorbed without realizing they were absorbing them. In reconstruction committees and agricultural cooperatives, in schoolrooms and town halls, former prisoners of Camp Hearn and Camp Alva and Camp Concordia and 400 other American installations applied what they had learned about democratic governance, about free markets, about racial complexity, about the relationship between human dignity and productive labor, to the project of making something livable from what the war had left behind. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Germany's infrastructure. Former American prisoners rebuilt something harder to build and more important to keep. They rebuilt its civic imagination. They rebuilt its capacity to believe that a different kind of society was possible, because they had lived inside one. America's greatest victory in the Second World War was not the beaches of Normandy, though those were paid for in blood that demands remembrance. It was not Midway, or the Bulge, or the fall of Berlin. It was not the atomic bomb. America's greatest victory happened in prison camps across Texas and Kansas and Colorado and Oklahoma and Rhode Island, where the most effective weapon deployed against Nazi ideology turned out to be a teenage girl at a soda fountain, sharing a milkshake with a boy, completely indifferent to the stunned German soldier watching through the window. That soldier would spend the rest of his life trying to explain what he had seen. If this story hit you the way it should, if it made you rethink what power really looks like, what victory actually means, what a society communicates through its smallest and most ordinary moments, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because the stories that stay with you longest are the ones that ask you to reconsider what you thought you already knew. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that fell through the cracks of the history books, the ones that happened in the margins while everyone was watching the front lines, subscribe, because there are more of them. There are always more of them, and someone has to tell them.
Subscribe our channel for more videos.